It was meant to capture the happiest day of their lives. A summer afternoon in 1897, in the quiet English village of Greystone Hollow. Inside a small stone chapel, a camera's shutter blinked once, just once, and froze a moment that would outlive every person who stood before that lens. At first glance, the photograph is ordinary, a young bride, a proud groom, the soft haze of daylight spilling through stained glass. Yet the longer one looks, the more the image begins to resist comfort. The bride's expression is not joy, it's vacancy. Her eyes seem to drift beyond the room, fixed on something no one else can see. Her lips form the shape of a smile, but hold no life behind them. Even her hand, clutching a bouquet of lilies, appears stiff, as though frozen by something colder than fear. For decades, the picture hung in parlors and attics, passed from family to family with whispered warnings. They said it was cursed. Some claimed the bride's gaze followed them. Others swore the flowers in the image seemed to darken with time. But nobody asked the questions that mattered. Why was the bride's ring finger discolored beneath her band? Why did the photographer Edmund Cawley vanish only 2 days after taking the portrait? When the glass plate negative resurfaced in a private collection nearly a century later, historians assumed it was just another relic of the Victorian age, until modern analysis revealed something impossible: faint bruising around the bride's neck, a pallor inconsistent with life. That discovery transformed what once seemed like a love story into evidence of a hidden crime. Tonight, we retrace the path from that single photograph to the truth it concealed, a truth buried beneath wealth, silence, and the rigid politeness of 19th century England. This is not folklore. It is the documented story of Margaret Hensley and her husband, Charles Whitlock, and of the wedding portrait that exposed a murder. England, 1897. The final years of the Victorian century, a time when appearances meant everything, and a family's worth was measured not by honesty, but by how well they concealed the truth. Photography, still a relatively new art, had become a mirror for that obsession. To be photographed was to be remembered, frozen in the dignity and decorum expected of a proper household. Yet behind the elegance of every portrait lay the unspoken rule: never show what hurts, never reveal what's real. In that same summer, tucked among the rolling moors of Yorkshire, sat the small village of Greystone Hollow. It was the kind of place where gossip travelled faster than light, and the church bell dictated the rhythm of life. Superstitions thrived there, whispers of ghosts in the churchyard, omens in the wind. And yet beneath that rustic calm, the village hid more than its share of silence. It was in Greystone Hollow that Charles Whitlock, the son of a prosperous merchant family, prepared to wed Margaret Hensley, a modest seamstress known for her quiet grace. Their match raised eyebrows, his fortune, her humility, but Charles was persuasive, charming, and accustomed to getting what he wanted. Those who knew him well spoke of his temper, though rarely above a whisper. The wedding was small but splendid. Guests described the air as heavy with the scent of lilies and the faint click of Edmund Cawley's camera, the local photographer who had built his livelihood capturing the lives and deaths of the village's residents. In that era, the line between celebration and mourning was thin. The same lens that documented weddings also recorded funerals, and the same careful posing was used whether the subject was living or recently departed. Within weeks of the ceremony, tragedy struck. Margaret was dead, the cause listed simply as fever. Her passing stirred pity, not suspicion. The Whitlocks mourned behind closed doors, and the town soon forgot. Life moved on, until 90 years later, when a fragile glass plate negative labelled Whitlock, June 1897, resurfaced in the Leeds Historical Archive. During the digitisation of Victorian images, a historian named Dr. Eleanor Markham paused at that wedding portrait and noticed something the others hadn't: the bride's complexion, her posture, the lifeless stillness of her gaze. What began as an archival curiosity would unravel into one of the most disturbing historical investigations ever tied to a single photograph. It began, as many revelations do, with an accident. In 1987, inside the quiet, dust-scented corridors of the Leeds Historical Archives, a curator named Dr. Eleanor Markham was sorting through a forgotten crate of Victorian glass plate negatives. Most were unremarkable: wedding portraits, christenings, and posed family scenes. their smiles stiff and eyes ghostly pale from long exposure. But one plate, cracked across its surface and faintly labelled Whitlock, June 1897, caught her attention. At first it was curiosity that made her hold it up to the light. The image shimmered faintly, the details dim beneath decades of grime. But even through the distortion, something felt unsettling. The bride's hand, resting delicately upon her bouquet, displayed an odd discoloration, darker than the surrounding tones. It wasn't the artifact of age, nor a flaw in the photographic emulsion. To Markham's trained eye, it was biological. She catalogued the plate for preservation, but the image haunted her. Late one evening, she decided to reprocess it using enhanced light exposure techniques, a method designed to reveal hidden detail without damaging fragile negatives. What emerged was startling. Around the bride's neck, faint shadows appeared, uneven marks, symmetrical, suggestive of bruising. Her complexion, once thought pale due to overexposure, now appeared mottled, drained of warmth. Markham consulted forensic imaging specialists from the University of Leeds. Their conclusion was tentative, but chilling. The woman in the photograph might not have been alive when the image was taken. Such practices, while shocking today, were not entirely foreign to the Victorian age. Post-mortem photography, also known as mourning portraiture, was a quiet but common ritual in the late 19th century. Families, unable to afford painted portraits, often paid photographers to capture one final likeness of their departed loved ones, posed to appear at rest, sometimes even standing or seated, with supports hidden beneath clothing. These images served as mementos, tokens of grief in a world where death was intimate and ever-present. But this case felt different. This wasn't a grieving family bidding farewell. It was a wedding portrait, staged and deliberate, its subjects dressed for celebration. There were flowers, rings, witnesses. Everything about the image screamed ceremony, not mourning. Yet the bride's body told another story entirely. If Margaret Hensley had been deceased, who arranged this photograph? And why disguise it as a marriage? Dr. Markham began to suspect something far darker, an elaborate cover-up, perhaps meant to protect a family's reputation or preserve a legal claim. Her unease deepened when she learned that the groom, Charles Whitlock, came from one of the wealthiest trading families in Yorkshire, a lineage known for both generosity and quiet influence. To verify her suspicions, Markham turned to the Public Records Office, searching for any mention of the Whitlock wedding or Margaret's death. What she found was both confusing and incomplete. The official registry listed the marriage date as June 3, 1897, yet Margaret's death certificate, filed in the same district, was dated June 2nd, a clerical error perhaps. But paired with the photograph's disturbing evidence, it raised an unignorable question. Was Margaret married after she was already dead? The deeper Markham dug, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Parish archives listed two separate witness names, one of which was later discovered to have died months before the wedding supposedly took place. Church records from Greystone Hollow showed missing entries. From that same week, pages torn cleanly from the logbook, every new discovery hinted at a truth no one wanted to believe. What had begun as a cracked glass plate now looked like a historical confession, an image that defied explanation, sitting quietly for nearly a century until modern light brought its secrets back into focus. As the questions grew, Dr. Markham's next move was inevitable. She would travel to Greystone Hollow itself, where the story had begun, to uncover who Margaret Hensley truly was and how a single photograph had become the silent witness to her death. Greystone Hollow was a village that never quite welcomed questions. When Dr. Eleanor Markham arrived in the winter of 1988, she found its streets unchanged, cobbled, mist-soaked, the church steeple leaning slightly, as though under the weight of memory. She came not as a journalist, but as an archivist, armed with a single cracked photograph and a mounting sense that something had been deliberately erased. Inside the parish hall, she requested access to the original marriage ledger. The clerk hesitated. The older volumes were fragile, he said, yet after some persistence he placed two thin registers before her. The first listed June 3, 1897, marriage of Charles Whitlock and Margaret Hensley. The signatures were faded but legible. Charles's in bold flourishes, Margaret's small and uneven, as if written by a trembling hand. 2 witnesses signed beneath, Edward Lane and Mary Tibbs, but among the loose papers, Markham found something that shouldn't have existed. Another certificate, same names, same church, dated July 2nd, 1897. Different witnesses, different handwriting. The ink was darker, fresher, and one line caught her breath. The officiating clergyman's signature was not the local vicar's, but that of a temporary curate who, records showed, had left the parish abruptly that same month. Why would a couple marry twice, as once in June, once in July? And why would the village keep both documents hidden for 90 years? To trace Margaret's final days, Markham sought out medical archives from the era. The official cause of death, written in looping Victorian cursive, read simply, consumption. Tuberculosis, the polite explanation for countless premature deaths. Yet among a cache of private correspondence donated to the archives decades earlier, Markham uncovered a letter penned by Thomas Elroy, an assistant to the coroner at the time. The note, yellowed and nearly illegible, mentioned a case that had disturbed the master greatly. It described a young woman married of late, showing discolorations about the throat and wrists inconsistent with wasting disease. The letter ended abruptly. The report was amended at the family's request. That single sentence reframed everything. The Whitlocks weren't merely mourners. They were participants in the shaping of an official story. Then came the discovery that sealed Markham's conviction. Among a collection of unsorted estate documents held by a private photography guild in York lay a fragile, soot-stained envelope labeled E. Carley, Apprentice Notes. Inside, written in hurried pencil, was a letter from George Milner, the young assistant who had worked under Edmund Cawley in 1897. It read, Mr. Cawley was summoned to the Whitlock residence after sundown. He seemed uneasy, said the lady was unwell. When we arrived, she was laid upon a chair, pale and still. Mr. Whitlock insisted she be photographed as planned. We were told to make her appear upright, eyes open if possible. Mr. Cawley refused at first, but the gentleman would not hear it. We took the plate twice. The second exposure was clearer. The lady was cold as stone. The handwriting faltered at the end, followed by a final line. He told me we mustn't speak of it. 2 nights later he was gone. Indeed, the records confirmed that Edmund Cawley vanished within 48 hours of that evening. His studio was found unlocked, equipment missing, ledger empty. Local newspapers offered no report of foul play, only a terse announcement. Photographer departs Greystone for London business. He was never seen again. With each fragment, the outline of a cover-up emerged. The Whitlock family, wealthy merchants with connections in Leeds and York, possessed the means to shape official narratives. In Victorian England, reputation was currency, and scandal could ruin generations. A dead bride on one's wedding day would have been intolerable, a hint of violence unthinkable. To preserve the image of decorum, truth itself had been rewritten. A death became a fever, a murder became a marriage. Margaret Hensley, a seamstress without fortune or family influence, became another casualty of silence. Markham noted the pattern that echoed through the archives. How often female suffering was tidied into euphemism, tucked beneath polite language, and sealed behind family crests. In Greystone Hollow, class was protection and silence was virtue. By the close of 1988, her findings drew quiet attention from forensic historians. They agreed that while the physical evidence was limited, the convergence of discrepancies, 2 certificates, contradictory medical notes, and the apprentice's testimony demanded scientific verification. If the photograph truly depicted a deceased woman, modern imaging could prove it. The next step was clear: a forensic reconstruction of the scene, using every available technique to test whether Margaret Hensley had been alive when the shutter fell. For the first time since 1897, light would once again strike that same image, not to immortalize love but to expose the anatomy of a lie. For nearly a century, the photograph of Margaret Hensley and Charles Whitlock had been dismissed as a curiosity, a relic of Victorian vanity and fading love. But in the sterile glow of a modern forensic lab, the past began to confess what the present could finally see. Dr. Eleanor Markham, now leading a team of historical forensic analysts, began by scanning the cracked glass plate at microscopic resolution. Each grain of silver nitrate, each chemical scar, held secrets of exposure and decay. Through digital restoration and spectral imaging, the shadows that once concealed the truth began to part. What appeared at first was not artistic imperfection but biological reality. When light spectrometry was applied, faint marbling appeared along the bride's neck and jawline, a pattern no early photographic error could produce. It was a subtle yet distinct sign of livor mortis, the pooling of blood that occurs after death, when gravity reclaims what the heart no longer can. The discoloration around her throat, previously dismissed as a trick of sepia tone, took on a darker implication. The experts concluded that Margaret's body had been lifeless for several hours before the exposure was made. Further analysis revealed something even more telling. The faint uneven hue on her ring finger, once thought to be a quirk of development, was under ultraviolet light consistent with bruising. The shadowed indentation around her wedding band suggested it had been placed on her finger after death, when her skin had already begun to stiffen. A reconstruction specialist mapped the posture of her hands and jaw. Comparing them to authentic Victorian wedding portraits, the difference was striking. Where living brides carried a natural tension of life, micromuscular control even in stillness, Margaret's hands appeared unnaturally heavy, her fingers curled with the rigidity of post-mortem stiffness. Her expression, frozen in a faint ghost-like smile, bore none of the subtle warmth typical of a breathing subject. The evidence aligned with a chilling timeline. The photograph had likely been taken between 8 and 12 hours after her death, but that begged the question, why? In Victorian England, post-mortem photography was not uncommon. The dead were dressed, posed and captured as keepsakes, a final effort to preserve their presence. Yet this was no mourning portrait. This was a wedding, a ceremony that declared unity, legality and ownership. Margaret was not remembered as a lost bride. She was presented as a living wife. To historians, the implication was clear. Someone had used her body not to grieve, but to gain. A discovery in the Whitlock family papers, preserved in a private estate collection, illuminated the motive. Among financial ledgers and correspondence, researchers found a legal document, the Hensley inheritance clause. It specified that the dowry, a substantial estate tied to Margaret's late father, could only transfer to her husband upon legal marriage before July 1, 1897. The death certificate, curiously dated June 29th, made the sequence dangerously tight. If Margaret had died before that date and the wedding took place after, then the entire transaction would have been null, unless the ceremony proceeded as if she were alive. This timeline created a sinister hypothesis. Margaret's death may have occurred in the final days of June. Facing financial ruin, Charles Whitlock, aided by compliant witnesses and an intimidated officiant, may have staged the wedding as a desperate act of deceit. To maintain appearances, he would have needed one man in particular, Edmund Cawley, the photographer. Cawley's reputation as a craftsman of post-mortem portraits made him the ideal accomplice. But his disappearance 2 days after the photograph was taken now looked less like coincidence and more like consequence. Historians revisiting Cawley's abandoned studio found remnants of his notes, fragments of invoices, and chemical residue consistent with emergency photographic processing. Someone had rushed the development, perhaps under pressure, perhaps under threat. As the forensic analysis unfolded, the image transformed from sentimental artifact to silent witness. It had captured not just a bride, but the moment of concealment, the exact instant when love, death, and greed intertwined before the indifferent lens of history. Forensic anthropologists recreated the lighting and shadow of that day using 3D modeling. When projected onto a digital render of Margaret's face, the spectral stains matched patterns of bruising, seen in mild strangulation. Pressure without fracture, enough to silence but not to mutilate. It was the kind of violence that could be disguised as illness, especially in a time when medical scrutiny bent easily under influence. Dr. Markham presented her findings at a private symposium in London, summarizing decades of folklore into a single, clinical truth. Margaret Hensley did not stand before the camera as a bride. She was placed there, positioned, adorned and immortalized, so that the living could profit from the dead. The revelation shook the field of historical criminology. Scholars revisited other Victorian portraits, wondering how many smiling couples had in fact been final farewells. But for the team investigating Greystone Hollow, one mystery still remained. What became of Charles Whitlock after the ceremony? Because if the photograph marked the moment of his triumph, the years that followed would reveal the beginning of his undoing. And in the quiet halls of his family estate, history suggests that the dead did not rest easily. By the summer of 1898, a year after Margaret Hensley's quiet funeral, the name Charles Whitlock had begun to circulate in Yorkshire's legal circles, not for murder, but for fraud. The charge was minor, almost trivial by Victorian standards, falsified invoices in a shipping transaction. But what investigators found while searching his home hinted at something far darker than financial deceit. During a routine examination of correspondence seized from Whitlock's office, a constable noticed a small stack of letters bound with faded twine. The handwriting was delicate but trembling, the ink blotched with haste. Each letter bore the same signature, E. Corley, the missing photographer. The letters were dated sporadically through late 1897 and early 1898. They began politely, requests for payment, apologies for delays in processing. But by the final note, the tone had shifted entirely. "You promised it would remain between us," one line read, "but I cannot bear the silence of that night. I hear her still, the click of the shutter, the weight of her head. I will speak if you do not make this right." The threat was unmistakable, exposure. Yet no such accusation ever reached the courts. Corley's disappearance remained unsolved, his studio abandoned, his name fading into the fog of unrecorded history. Without a witness, the prosecution ignored the letters, dismissing them as the ramblings of a disgruntled tradesman. Whitlock was fined for bookkeeping fraud and released. The case file was quietly closed, but in Greystone Hollow the silence carried weight. For decades, villagers whispered of a coffin that had been moved twice before burial. The first interment, they said, took place hastily at night. Days later, the coffin was exhumed under the supervision of Whitlock's family, claiming errors in record. When it was reburied, no priest was present, only Charles and 2 hired men. No one in the village spoke of it openly, but mothers told their daughters never to walk near the Whitlock plot after dusk. The truth had been buried as carefully as the body itself. More than a century later, genealogists and local historians began piecing together the Whitlock line. The surname, once common in Leeds, vanished after 1902. Census documents revealed a pattern of quiet name changes. Whitlock became Whitley, then Walden, as descendants moved south toward London. Whether this was shame or strategy, no one could say. In 2010, following years of legal negotiation, the Whitlock estate archives were finally unsealed for academic study. Inside the brittle pages of ledgers and letters, researchers found what might be the closest thing to a confession. Among the papers lay a small leather-bound diary belonging to Charles himself. The ink was pale, the script uneven, but legible enough to reveal a mind unraveling. The entries began with business dealings and family affairs, mundane, predictable, but by winter of 1897, they took on an almost fevered tone. "The room is cold even when the fire burns," one passage reads. "I cannot bring myself to look upon the mantel where the photograph rests. Her eyes follow. I thought I could bear it, but the silence grows heavier each night." A later entry, written weeks before his fraud trial, carried a single haunting line. "The portrait binds me." Her cold touch lingers still. It was not an admission of murder, but it reeked of guilt. The repetition of cold, the touch, the gaze, the silence, revealed an obsession, perhaps even a curse of conscience. Forensic psychologists, examining the diary in the 2010s, noted traits consistent with pathological guilt. A man tormented not by external punishment, but by the memory of an act he could not undo. Some argued he was complicit in the crime. Others believed he had simply exploited tragedy and lived long enough for remorse to rot him from within. The unsealed archives also contained fragments of communication between Charles and a solicitor, referencing the inheritance dispute settled under false pretenses. The solicitor's notes, cautious and coded, suggested knowledge of a manipulated certificate. Yet, as with all things Victorian, discretion trumped justice. The matter never reached public record. In the years that followed, the Whitlock name faded into historical obscurity. But the photograph did not. When forensic experts revisited the image in 2010 with advanced spectral scanning, they found chemical traces along its lower edge, residue consistent with early retouching compounds used to conceal blemishes or alter tones. Someone had deliberately lightened Margaret's neck and smoothed her jawline, erasing signs of trauma that 19th century eyes might have noticed, but modern light could resurrect. Piece by piece, the fragments of the story converged. A coerced photographer, a forged marriage, a hidden death, and a legacy of silence. In a televised roundtable aired shortly after the findings were published, historians, criminologists, and even surviving Whitlock descendants debated what truly happened in that summer of 1897. Was Margaret murdered, poisoned, or strangled to preserve a fortune, or had she died of natural illness, her body exploited in one final act of greed? Some called it madness, others control, the ultimate assertion of dominance in a society where women were possessions first, people second. One descendant, identified only as Amelia W., spoke on record. "We grew up with whispers that one of our ancestors married a ghost. No one ever said why. Now, I think he did it because he could, because in his world, even death wasn't enough to free her." The words lingered like an echo from the past, an indictment not just of one man, but of a time when power could disguise cruelty as ceremony. And so, through the convergence of technology, persistence, and historical memory, the truth, or as close to truth as the dead will allow, was finally exposed. More than a century after the shutter clicked, the image of Margaret Hensley ceased to be a mere curiosity. It became evidence not only of a single crime, but of an era's dark intersection between love, control, and decay. The final question that haunted every expert remained painfully unresolved. Was the photograph a portrait of devotion, or the ultimate proof that some vows are sealed not in love, but in death? The answer, perhaps, still stares from her unblinking eyes. Forever. Frozen in the sepia silence of 1897, the rediscovery of the Whitlock wedding photograph did more than reopen a century-old mystery. It forced historians, forensic experts, and the public to confront an uncomfortable truth about the Victorian world, that beneath its polished manners and rigid respectability lay an empire of silence, built upon the suffering of the powerless. When Dr. Eleanor Markham's findings were published in 2011, they sparked immediate debate across historical and artistic circles. What began as an obscure archival study became a cultural reckoning. Her work revealed how photography, once seen as a purely sentimental art, could also serve as an accomplice in deception. Fair tool not only for memory but for erasure. The image of Margaret Hensley, standing stiffly beside the man who may have killed her, became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition titled Truth in Photography. The exhibit chronicled how Victorian photographers manipulated death, disguising tragedy as dignity. Visitors were confronted by portraits of infants posed to look asleep, husbands propped upright in family gatherings, and finally, Margaret, a bride whose smile concealed mortality. Dr. Markham spoke of the photo not as a morbid relic, but as a mirror to society's hypocrisy. Victorian England worshipped the image of purity and virtue, she said, but their portraits often immortalize control, silence, and the ownership of women. The Whitlock photograph soon transcended its local origins. Art historians hailed it as the most disturbing and illuminating example of posthumous deception in British photographic history. Its haunting clarity revealed the psychological distance between what Victorians wanted the world to see and what they chose to hide. In 2013, newly authenticated documents, including the long-lost notes of the coroner's assistant, confirmed what modern forensics had already suggested. The record stated plainly, the lady presented signs of death exceeding 24 hours, bruising about the neck and lower mandible. No signs of fever or consumption present. The final confirmation erased any remaining doubt. Margaret Hensley had died before the photograph was taken. Whether by accident, violence, or deliberate act, her death was not natural, and the wedding portrait had been a carefully constructed illusion. Though Charles Whitlock was never tried for murder, his family name never escaped the shadow of the photograph. Local historians in Yorkshire still speak of the Whitlock estate as the house where vows were broken before they were spoken. His descendants, now living under altered surnames, have declined all interviews. The stain remains, invisible but indelible. Today, the glass plate negative rests in a temperature-controlled case within the National Museum's Dark Archives collection. Its placard reads simply, "The Wedding That Shouldn't Have Been, Greystone Hollow, 1897. Visitors often linger before it longer than any other artifact. Some claim the bride's eyes seem to follow them, not in anger, but in quiet endurance. A century has passed, yet her gaze remains unblinking, suspended forever between love and death, truth and artifice, and in that silent stare, the Victorian illusion of perfection finally fractures, leaving behind only the cold, immutable truth that photographs may not capture life, but sometimes they preserve the moment it ended. One photograph, a single frozen moment in time, can alter the way we understand history. It reminds us that truth does not fade with the paper or the ink that holds it. It lingers quietly, waiting for eyes brave enough to look past the surface. The Whitlock wedding portrait began as a curiosity, a relic of Victorian sentimentality, but beneath its varnish of love and ceremony, it concealed an act of violence, one that outlived every person involved. Margaret Hensley's image forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea that photographs are not always memories. Sometimes they are masks, composed to hide the rot beneath beauty, to make death appear dignified, to let cruelty masquerade as devotion. Every photograph from the past carries its own silence, the kind that only breaks when someone dares to listen closely enough. Margaret's eyes, fixed and eternal, remind us that history does not bury its victims, it frames them. And sometimes all it takes is a flicker of light, or a second look, to bring them back into focus. So we must ask ourselves, if one wedding portrait could expose a murder, how many others still hang quietly on our walls hiding the same truth?